The string lights over the country club patio caught every diamond in the room except mine because I was the one holding the camera bag while my younger sister did her third outfit change. We'd gathered for my grandmother's 70th, and my mother had already arranged everyone twice for the photographer she'd hired off some Atlanta Society referral. She turned to me with that practiced sweetness she saved for an audience. "Honey, would you mind stepping back? We want the light to land on the girls, and you're casting a shadow. Just hold your sister's clutch, would you?" My sister handed me the little crystal beaded thing without looking at me, the way you'd hand your coat to a valet. I took it. I didn't say a word. My phone buzzed against my hip. One line on the screen. Wire confirmed $4.2 million released to escrow. The lake house on the North Shore, the one my father had been trying to buy for 9 years and could never quite close on, had just become mine an hour before this party started. I slid the phone back in my pocket and looked at all of them lined up under the lights, my mother's hand resting on my sister's shoulder like she was presenting a trophy. They had no idea I'd just bought the one piece of property in this entire county that my father actually wanted, and that the broker who'd kept telling him it was under contract for the last 2 years had been quietly selling it to me the whole time. I stepped back out of the frame. But I didn't leave. I'm the older daughter. I'm 31. And before I tell you how a woman everyone at that party assumed was struggling to pay rent ended up owning the thing my father wanted most in the world, drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever been the one they asked to step out of the picture? I genuinely want to read it. I didn't storm off. Storming off is for people who still want a reaction. I was past wanting reactions from these people sometime around my 26th birthday, which they forgot. I walked across the patio, past the bar, and set my sister's clutch down on a cocktail table next to somebody's half-finished gin and tonic. Let her come find it. The valet had my car up front before I reached the doors because I tipped him $40 on the way in, which is more than anyone in my family has ever tipped anyone, because tipping well is a thing you do when you remember what it's like to be the person carrying the tray. Everyone in that room thought I drove 40 minutes back to a one-bedroom apartment in a part of town they'd never visited. My mother liked to tell people I did something with spreadsheets in a tone that suggested data entry. I let her. I drove 20 minutes the other direction, up the shore road, past the gate code I'd memorized weeks ago, and pulled into the circular drive of a 6-bedroom lake house with floor-to-ceiling glass facing the water. The caretaker, an older man named Mr. Drek, Okafor, who'd worked that property for 30 years across 4 owners, was waiting on the porch with the keys. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Welcome home. First time I'd been called that by anyone since I was a teenager, and the last time it hadn't meant anything." I want to be precise about something, because people hear a story like this and assume it was rage. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot and stupid, and it makes you do things on Instagram at 2 in the morning. What I felt was closer to the quiet you get when a long equation finally balances. I'd been running the numbers on my family for most of my life, and that night the columns finally added up to 0. You have to understand the economics of how I grew up, because it was an economy, and I was the part of the budget they were always trying to cut. My sister was the asset. I was the expense. That's not bitterness, that's accounting. When she was 16, they leased her a car, a little white convertible, so she'd make the right impression at the prep school they'd moved her into. That same year, I asked for $900 to take a coding certificate course at the community college over the summer, and my mother looked at me like I'd asked her to fund a cult. She said, and I remember it exactly, that I needed to be realistic about what I was suited for. Suited for? Like I was a piece of furniture that came in one size. For my sister's 18th, they threw a party that cost more than my car. There was a chocolate fountain. There was a man playing a harp. My 18th, I got a card with $40 in it and a note that said they knew I'd figure things out, which was their way of saying they'd stopped looking at me directly somewhere around middle school. My grandmother slipped me an extra 100 that day when no one was watching and squeezed my hand. She was the only one who ever looked at me like I was a person and not a line item. And I'll come back to her because she matters more to this story than anyone. Here's the thing about being the kid nobody watches. You get to watch them. While my sister was learning which fork to use and how to laugh at the right moments, I was in the back of every room, invisible, taking notes. Not on purpose at first, it was just survival. You learn to read a room fast when the room has decided you're furniture. I learned to tell from the set of my father's jaw at dinner whether he'd had a good day at the firm or whether another client had walked. I learned that my mother's voice climbed half an octave when she was lying about money to her friends. I learned that the family that looked, from the outside, like it was made of granite was actually built on a second mortgage and a line of credit and the desperate, exhausting work of pretending. My father ran a regional commercial real estate firm. To hear him talk at dinner parties, he was a titan. The truth, which I pieced together over years of being the daughter nobody bothered to send out of the room, was that he was leveraged to the eyeballs. He'd made one good deal in the 90s, an office park, and spent the next 2 decades borrowing against the memory of it. He was the kind of man who confused owning debt with owning wealth. I didn't set out to ruin anyone. I want that on the record. I set out to disappear, and disappearing turned out to be the most profitable thing I ever did. That community college course my mother wouldn't pay for, I waitressed double shifts for a summer and paid for it myself. Then I got a job doing data analysis for a logistics company. The boring kind of work nobody at family dinners asked a single question about, which suited me fine, because while everybody assumed I was filing reports, I was learning how money actually moves. Not the way my father understood it, as a thing you display, but the way it actually works in flows and patterns and the gaps where nobody's paying attention. I started small. I had a knack for spotting undervalued things, mostly because I'd spent my whole life being one. A duplex in a neighborhood everyone said was finished 6 months before the new transit line was announced. A strip of commercial lots nobody wanted. I reinvested everything. I lived in that one-bedroom apartment for 8 years, while my net worth quietly passed a number I will not say out loud at family dinners, because at family dinners I still let them believe I was scraping by. It was useful, being underestimated. A person nobody's watching can move a lot of money around without anyone asking where it came from. And then, about 2 years ago, I learned my father was trying to buy the lake house. I knew that house. Everybody in our family knew that house. When I was 9, before the firm started bleeding, before everything went brittle, we'd rented it for one single summer week, and it was the only stretch of my childhood I'd ever describe as happy. My father had loved it. He used to stand on that dock and say, "One day this is going to be mine." It became his whole idea of having made it. The lake house was the trophy that would prove to everyone, to my mother's friends, to his old college roommates, to whatever judge sits in his head, that he was who he said he was. So when I heard through a broker I'd worked with that the lake house was finally coming available, and that my father had been circling it for years but kept getting outbid by an anonymous buyer, I did the math. I'd love to tell you I agonized over it. I didn't. I did the math, and the math said, buy it. Not to live in. I didn't even want it, not really. I wanted to know that I could. I wanted for once in my life to be the one who couldn't be stepped around. So that anonymous buyer who kept outbidding my father, that was me. For 2 years. I sat in my apartment that night after the party, on a folding chair eating cereal for dinner, because that's still what I eat when I'm thinking, and I let the whole childhood play back. Not like a wound. Like a spreadsheet I was auditing for the first time with adult eyes, finally understanding why every cell came out the way it did. The thing that changed it from a story about real estate into a story about justice came 3 days later, and it came from my grandmother. She called me, which she almost never did, because my mother had spent years subtly managing the distance between us. My grandmother was the one with the real money. Old, careful, generational money. The kind my father married into and then spent the next 30 years pretending he'd made himself. She was sharp as a tack at 70, and she knew exactly who in her family was real and who was performance. She asked me to come see her, alone. "Don't tell your mother," she said, and there was something in her voice that made the back of my neck go cold. She sat me down at her kitchen table. the same table I'd done homework at while my sister was off at her enrichment programs, and she put a folder in front of me. Inside was a college fund. My college fund. The one my parents had told me when I was 18 had been wiped out in the market. The reason they'd said that there was no money for me to go to a real school, the reason I'd worked my way through community college while my sister went to a private university with a lazy river on campus, it hadn't been wiped out in any market. My grandmother had funded it, $190,000 set aside for me specifically in trust starting the year I was born. And at some point when I was 19, while I was working a register and convincing myself I just wasn't the kind of person who got to go to college, my parents had liquidated it, forged my signature on the disbursement. My grandmother only found out because she'd finally pulled the old account records when she was updating her will, and the numbers didn't match what my mother had told her. She slid the bank document across the table. There was my signature in handwriting that was almost mine, but not quite, dated to a week when I was 4 states away. And there, on the next page, was where the money went. Most of it had paid the deposit and first 2 years of tuition at my sister's university. My grandmother looked at me with her hands folded and she said very quietly, "I don't think you should let them keep getting away with it. And I want you to know, whatever you decide to do, I'm with you." I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about the temptation because the cheap version of the story is the one where I burn everything down. I had the means to. I held my father's lake house. I quietly bought into the note on his firm's main building through a fund, which meant I held a piece of his livelihood too. Not the whole thing. I want to be accurate, but a meaningful piece, enough to matter. I could have called everything due at once. I could have walked into his office and watched his face do what faces do. But here's what I learned from a lifetime of being the one nobody watched. The people who need an audience are the ones who lose when you take the audience away. My parents didn't fear poverty. They feared being seen as ordinary. The cruelest thing I could do was not to destroy them loudly. It was to make them small, quietly, and let them know I'd done it on purpose. So I didn't call the firm's note. I'm not in the business of putting 40 people out of work to settle a score with 2. That mattered to me, and it should matter. What I did instead was simpler. I called my father and asked him to meet me. He assumed, I'm sure, that his struggling daughter wanted to borrow money or apologize for leaving the party early. He suggested a restaurant. I said, no, come to my office, and I gave him an address downtown. He thought it was a co-working space. He told my mother as much. I heard about it later, that I probably rented a desk by the hour somewhere and wanted to impress him. He showed up in his good blazer, the one he wears when he wants to feel like the most important man in the room. The address was the top floor of a building he'd tried and failed to lease space in 2 years earlier. My name was on the door because I owned the floor, not rented, owned. I watched him come off the elevator on the camera in my office. I watched him check the directory, frown, check it again. I watched a young woman at the front desk say, "Oh yes, she's expecting you, right this way." And I watched my father's face try to make the math work and fail, the same way it always failed, because he never understood that money isn't the thing you show people. It's the thing that lets you stop needing to. He sat down across from me at a long table with the river behind it, and he tried, for about 90 seconds, to be in charge. He talked about how I'd embarrassed the family at Grandma's party, how my mother was hurt, how it was time I grew up and started acting like part of this family. I let him finish. Then I slid a folder across the table, same kind of folder my grandmother had used. I think she'd have liked that. He opened it. The first page was the deed to the lake house. His lake house. The one he told everyone for 9 years would be his, with my name on it. He went very still. The second page was the bank disbursement from my college fund with the forged signature dated to a week he and my mother both knew I'd been out of state because I'd been at my sister's college, ironically helping her move into the dorm their fraud had paid for. He started to say something about the market, about how it was complicated, about how they'd always meant to pay it back. The same lies worn smooth from use. I didn't raise my voice. I've never had to raise my voice in that room because I owned it. I told him I wasn't going to call the note on his building. I watched the relief start to flood his face, and then I told him why. Because, I said, I don't need to take everything from you to make my point. I just need you to spend the rest of your life knowing that the daughter you treated like the help is the reason you'll never own that house on the lake. Every time you drive the shore road and see it, that's mine. Every time someone asks if you ever closed on it, you'll have to say no, and you'll know who did. I told him the lake house wasn't going to sit empty either. I'd already filed the paperwork. It was becoming a retreat, a real one, with a real endowment behind it, for young women aging out of foster care, the ones the system stops watching the day they turn 18. Kids who get handed $40 and a note that says they'll figure it out. I told him my grandmother's name was going on it because she was the only person in this family who ever bothered to watch me. My mother wasn't there. She'd refused to come, which told me everything. My father went home and told her, and she did the thing she always does, which was to make it about how cruel I was being, how cold, how I'd always been difficult. I know because she sent a long message that I read once and didn't answer. I didn't need her to understand. That was the part I finally let go of, sitting in that office with the river going by. For 30 years, I'd been quietly hoping that if I just got successful enough, or quiet enough, or useful enough, they'd finally turn the camera toward me. They never were going to. Some people will never see you, not because there's anything wrong with your light, but because seeing you would mean admitting what they did in the dark. My grandmother came to the lake house the day we opened it. She walked out onto the dock, the same dock my father used to stand on and dream about being more than he was. And she took my hand, the way she had at my 18th birthday, and she said she was proud of me. Not proud of what I'd built. Proud of me. There's a difference, and at 31, standing on that dock, it was the first time anyone in my family had ever said the second kind. People ask me sometimes, the few I tell, whether it was worth it. All that money, all those years, to make a point to two people who will never admit they were wrong. But I didn't do it to make a point to them. I did it for the 9-year-old who had one happy week on that lake and spent the next 20 years being told she'd figure it out. She figured it out. If you're the one they keep asking to step out of the frame, keep going. Build it in the quiet. One day the picture's going to be yours, and they're going to have to ask you for permission to stand in it. The truth I carried off that dock is simpler than the money makes it sound. Nothing in my family happened by accident. The $40 card and the chocolate fountain, the convertible and the community college, the wiped out fund that was never wiped out. Those weren't bad luck. They were choices made by two people over and over, and choices come back to find you. My parents spent 30 years deciding I was the expense and my sister was the asset, and the bill for that decision came due on a Tuesday afternoon in an office they didn't know I owned. I didn't engineer their downfall. I just stopped absorbing the cost of it, and the math finally ran the other way. What I tell anyone who feels invisible in their own house is this: the first thing that saved me wasn't talent. It was refusing to become what they were. I held a piece of my father's livelihood, and I chose not to call it, because 40 employees had done nothing to me, and a person who pays back cruelty with cruelty just becomes a new cruel person with a bigger bank account. Keeping your hands clean when you finally have the power to dirty them. That's the thing that lets you sleep. Don't lose that. It's worth more than the lake house. The second thing was paying attention. For years, I thought being unseen was my curse, and it turned out to be my education. While they performed, I watched, and I learned how money actually moves instead of how it's displayed. Curiosity in the back of the room beats applause in the front of it. Read the world closely. Notice the gap between what people say about money and what their faces do when the check comes. That habit, more than any single deal, is what built everything. And the third thing, the one nobody can give you, is that you have to keep going when there is no audience and no reward and no proof yet that you're right. 8 years in a one-bedroom apartment, eating cereal, reinvesting every dollar while my family told their friends I did something with spreadsheets. Nobody clapped. There was no camera turned my way. You build it anyway, in the quiet, on the days it feels pointless, because the only person whose belief you actually need is the one in the folding chair. My grandmother saw me on that dock and said she was proud of me, not of what I'd built, of me. And I understood, at 31, that I'd spent my whole life waiting for the wrong people to say it. Don't wait the way I waited. Become someone you'd be proud of, and find the one or two who already see you, and let the rest keep posing for a photographer who will never point the lens your way. They asked me to step out of the frame, so I went and built one of my own. You can too.